I think the most important thing to understand about the earlier war is that it was simultaneously a civil war and a war of independence and an international war. So it was all three things at the same time. So this earlier war took place in Vietnam after World War II. It's known in the West as the First Indochina War. Among Vietnamese people, it tends to be called the War of Resistance or Resistance War or the Anti-French Resistance period. So I'll start by talking about how it was a civil war and a war of independence. So after the end of World War II, the various Vietnamese revolutionary groups competed against each other. They all wanted to be the first to seize power and the first to declare national independence and, of course, the first to establish an independent government. The communists were the quickest to act, and so they seized power, declared national independence, and established a government. Now, at this point, the communists expected the other revolutionaries to submit to the authority of the Communist Party, but the other revolutionary groups expected the communists to share power. This disagreement erupted in violence in some parts of the country. In the midst of this disagreement, the French returned and tried to retake Vietnam, tried to recolonize Vietnam. And the revolutionaries fought back. Now, the revolutionaries fought against the French, but they also fought against each other. And gradually, the revolutionary movement split between the communists on the one hand and all of the other groups on the other. Now, these other groups included the Republican nationalist parties. It also included some of these religious groups that had turned revolutionary. And these various groups were all very anti-communist. If not at the start of the conflict, then over the course of the conflict, they became anti-communist because they opposed the Communist Party. So even in the early years of the conflict, this war was an internal one between Vietnamese and a war of independence against France. And then about halfway through the war became an international one. The Americans began providing aid to the French, and the Chinese began providing aid to the communist-dominated fledgling Vietnamese government. These three aspects of the First Indochina War, we see these same three aspects during the Vietnam War. For some Vietnamese, this was primarily a civil war between competing groups of Vietnamese, the communists and the anti-communists. There were other Vietnamese who saw this primarily as a war against foreigners, a war against outside invaders. Instead of the French, it was against the Americans. And then there were other people, some Vietnamese and some non-Vietnamese outside of Vietnam, who saw this war primarily as an international war. So we see these continuities between the earlier war and the later one, in that many of the characteristics that define the earlier one also define the later one.